This is Bam Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with Laura Gabayan. And hope I didn't mess that up, but you're an author and you're a researcher. And I want to thank you for being a guest on the Bam Electric Ghost. This is the first time you've been on the show. And we're going to talk about your life story and your book. We do have your website up. We'll talk more about that later. And before we get into like the heart of your story, we do ask every guest these two questions before we really get into anything: is what motivates you, and why do you do what you do?
Well, thank you for having me. So let me tell you the story behind all this and why do I do. I'm a physician researcher, and I was very set in my ways, doing publishing, writing papers, doing research, and then in 2013, my body started to fall apart and I developed weakness, and you can hear that I slur my speech. And my legs started to get weak, and I was like, well, what's going on? And then I started to initially, I was gung ho only medicine and like Western medicine because that's what I am. And then I realized, wait, it's actually a curse. Knowing the diagnoses and specifics kind of led people to stick to that and not think outside the box. And
Mhm.
so the people who actually, and then I was like, well, who thinks outside the box? And I was the wise. And then I looked at the history of wisdom and what we knew about wisdom. And I'm like, wait a second, we don't know much. It's anecdotal and it's very subjective. If religions talk about it, famous people talk about it, but we don't know. So then I created the Wisdom Research Project. And I hired a research assistant and I hired a marketing person as well. And we start telling people, do you know someone who's wise? Now, before I did that, I did know how to do research. So I looked at the history of what was known about wisdom. We knew that it had an inverse relationship with age. So around 50s, 60s, 70s are the wisest. And we also knew that it was not associated with political affiliation, with race or gender. It is associated with location. And
Mhm.
so that's why we stuck to North America. And the only people who can identify someone who's wise are other people. There were so many tests and questionnaires, but none of them matched up to a human being saying that person is wise. So then we posted on Reddit, posted on Nextdoor, on social media, everywhere. Do you know someone who's wise? And someone would nominate someone and be like, oh, I know this person or this. And then that person who I interviewed knew someone else. And hence, I interviewed 60 wise individuals from October of 22 until April of 23.
That's
And their
interesting.
ages were around 50 to 79. They had to be. And that's how it grew. And that's how what I did. And then I came up with the 8 common elements they had in common, hence the word common wisdom. And that's when we came up with those 8 elements of resilience, kindness, positivity, spirituality, humility, tolerance, creativity, and curiosity.
That's interesting. So, if you were going to kind of give us some of the metrics from what you've researched, out of all those people, were there any commonalities in terms of the types of careers they were in, or it didn't
There
really
were
matter?
no commonalities. The one thing, so the order I gave you was the order that was most common. So resilience was the most common element. And one thing I want to tell everyone is I interviewed 60 people, and these were all over the place. They had no idea each other was. They were all over. And yet, of those 60, only one person had all 8.
Oh
So
wow.
it's not common to have them. I think it's important for you to look at those 8 and say, well, I'm really good at this. I'm not good at that. And I need to build this, for example. So that, and being a researcher and scientist, I really needed more objectivity. I needed to break it down. So that's what I did.
Was there any like education level where the people high school bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD, did that factor in?
No, I never asked them that because as a scientist, I can't. The only thing I can do, and I can't meddle with the people I'm interviewing except for their age. That
Mhm.
was the only restriction. Be 50 to 79 years old. And it's funny because initially my research assistant and my marketing person both thought that wisdom correlated with education. And I'm
Mm.
like, well, think about it. We all know people who are very educated, but they're not necessarily wise. They don't make great decisions. They may not have good lives,
No
and
common
vice
sense.
versa. We may know people who are not very educated, but yet give great advice and they live good lives. So the two don't go hand in hand. And also, what doesn't go hand in hand is age. I mean, it did have an inverse relationship with age, but all older individuals are not necessarily wiser.
Yeah, because I was wondering that because there's sometimes you could have somebody who's a kind of phenom. Like you can get somebody like I'm a musician, so I've run into people who are like 12 years old, and they're better than an 80-year-old on piano. I mean, they just are just phenomenal, or on a violin, or they just are a master. And it would be kind of like, how could they be a master at such a young age? You would think they would have had to put the 10,000 hours in to get to that level. And there's some people that have, and I've run into people who are like mathematicians, physicists, because I'm in IT, and I run into a lot of people. And there's some people you would have think they went to MIT, but they're self-taught. They're self-taught mathematicians, self-taught physicists, self-taught people who are like brilliant at design and engineering. They just had some capability, and it really is hard to measure. Like everybody wants to have these in the box kind of expectations.
I
But
think
since I yeah,
that was my hardest issue with all this is people are so quick to judge. People are so quick to put labels on, and people are so quick to like put you in a box, like you said.
yeah, because it's like a lot of times, like, in industry today, I'm in information technology, software design. It used to be you had to have your comp sci degree, you had to be a BA, MA, and if you're in the high levels of architecture, PhD. Now we're actually go reaching out to people that don't have any credentials, but they show amazing capability, and we don't judge them by the normal standards of, oh, what's your SAT score, what college did you go to. We look at what they actually can do. We look at what they bring to the table.
So
And
their
so
work ethic and their tenacity is important to you,
yeah,
right?
but it's also maybe we can run into people who are kind of like, they're hobbyists, or you could call like hackers, or people who had ability, but it couldn't be measured by their degrees or the credentials or the acronyms on their name. They just were so passionate that they found a way to do it
Yeah.
without the formal education. And when they present and they have ideas that are worth a lot, they bring things to the whiteboard that nobody else in the room would have ever thought of. And that's what we're looking for, those type of people who sometimes are neurodivergent, or they might have autism, they might have disabilities. And a lot of times people never gave them a shot. And now we're starting to see these people that society threw away or did not consider to be valuable actually have a lot of the stuff that we need
You
in
know,
our
the
business.
issue with disabilities, I mean, I essentially acquired one and I didn't initially I thought I knew what it was and I didn't know, and then medicine had no name for it. It's kind of gone back and forth. And my med school friends wanted a name, And the people who knew me didn't discount me because they knew who I was, but everyone else saw what I had. They forgot who I was. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm very sensitive to labeling and to judging.
Well, it's very important because there's like it's hard, like you said, like somebody's idea of wisdom might be some, J.R.R. Tolkien wizard in, Lord of the Rings. And they're wearing the big robe and they've got that's their idea. Like there's this master wizard and they've been around for like 89 years and they've built up all this capability, but they discount like what if it's like the 21-year-old that has this brilliant way of looking at the world and a way of asking questions that nobody asks. They start to uncover things because they're not scared of being like, oh, well, you're putting yourself out there. Because I think a lot of times what I've seen is vulnerability people are scared of. So they won't raise their hand, they won't put something up. The people who gain a lot of wisdom are the people who are not scared to ask about the things that they don't know.
Well, I always say live in faith, don't live in fear. And people are like, well, but this, but that, but that's all fear. It's all fear based. Control is fear based. So it's really important, like you said, to live in faith.
Yeah, because fear is like the source of all the things that can go wrong. Because like I always felt like if you have to tread a little bit of water in life. Like once you learn something, right? Once you did your 10,000 hours, like, and I learned my piano, I learned my bass guitar, I learned how to program. But guess what? Like I learned, COBOL. Well, COBOL is mainframe, and the mainframes aren't really there. Well, I still do work on them, but everybody's in the blockchain, everybody's in the .NET, everybody's in the AI. It's like so I have to relearn all the time. In my industry, I can't just rest on my laurels. I can't just say, well, I only know this and that's what I'm going to try to stay in. I constantly have to go to school. And some people don't like that. They want to know that they reached some level and then they can kind of, just be stable. Not that they have to phone it in, but they don't want to have to be challenged every day. They don't feel comfortable in that kind of scenario.
True. Well, it's funny because if one of my elements, my last one, was curiosity, and being curious, I think is the foundation for all of wisdom. All the eight. And as you said, it's not you can be curious but not have a formal degree. And being curious does not mean being stable, like you said. It's not being just the status quo. It's kind of thinking outside the box and kind of continuing.
Yeah, is it somebody that questions the canon? Like there's a canon of knowledge and somebody questions like why is that law, why is that theorem true? And
Right.
a lot of research scientists they'll prove, oh this physics theory is actually not correct. And they'll spend their life, taking the heat against the people who wrote the theory and say, no, 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 it's correct. And they push it. And that's the way, in art, people who push in the genre, right? There was a give an example, Miles Davis. He was kind of like the king of bebop type of jazz. Then he reinvented himself with fusion. All the bebop people said that he was like, what are you doing? That jazz is not fusion, jazz is bebop. And he says, no, jazz is whatever I want it to be. So if it's going to be fusion, it's fusion. And then people say, well, now you're like a Judas, you're wrecking everything. You can't go there. But that's what people do when they push the boundaries. Like even somebody who established like the canon is willing to say, oh no, that's not it anymore. Let's try something else. And we're like, oh, how can you do that? And it's really when you're willing to say, hey, I'm not going to just rest on my laurels for the rest of my life. I'm going to push and go into areas where I might not be the best. It might not be what you like, but I'm going to try it anyway because, like, why not see what's over on the other side?
Yeah, we all have it in us because think about my last two elements, creativity and curiosity, are things we all have as kids. So it's a matter of whether or not we focus on it, we strengthen it, or we don't, or we hush it down. So I think we all can be creative, we all can be curious, and we can be more of it, but it all depends.
You feel like I've talked to people and they feel like the childlike curiosity kind of gets pushed out of us as we're told to mature and grow up. And when I've met with a lot of creative people, sometimes we get judged and say, well, you guys are like immature. You musicians, you artists, like, well, you're so immature. It's like, why are you taking all these risks? Why are you doing these things? It's like, didn't you grow up? It's like, wait a minute, grow up. I have to grow out of having the curiosity of saying, like, why is that not possible? Why couldn't I go and go with and do a local theater? I'm not the best actor, but why not try that? Like,
You,
why
you
why
know,
why
you're
not go
you're
and try something different? Then like, oh, I can't do that because I'm not young enough. I'm not adventurous enough. Like, why not?
No, you're talking about something I noticed in the people I interviewed was that they were very at peace. And they were so wisdom in a way was a code word for being at peace and thinking it'll be okay. And probably not worrying about the future, not worrying about why am I not this or that or this, but really just being okay with it. As I said, the first element we found in my project, consistent with wisdom, was resilience, despite the horrible things these people have gone through. Horrible. Like, you think your life can be bad, like horrible. They
Mhm.
were just, they were content. They had meaning. And so, and they, as you know, they didn't worry. So,
That's interesting because what element was the most difficult to describe or to put in context? Like, which element was like hard to actually, you know,
oh,
equate
for
to?
me,
Yeah,
for
well, I
me,
guess in your research when you're doing like you have the 8 elements and then you're trying to kind of put it into context or describe it amongst all these people who you're looking at. And whereas there's some like resilience, I think people can understand that. They can understand what that kind of means and they can get their head around it. But were there other elements that were harder to describe or put into context?
so for me, just the writing part, when I was writing chapters of the book, the part that was hardest was spirituality, because I'm a physician and I always grew up thinking if you don't see it, it doesn't exist.
Mhm.
And if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. So that's just, and it was just a hard chapter. So I initially started, and then my editor was like, no, why don't you write the whole book and get back to it? And I did. I wrote the whole book, and then that was the last one I did. And this time it was a lot easier because I had gotten down what was important and what was not. And for them, that was funny because the questions in the beginning part of the book, I talk about the questions everyone was asked. They were asked the same 10 questions. And none of these questions alluded to, oh, what's in, like, what do you think wisdom is, etc. It was, a lot of it was, what we got out of interviewing them, what I got, all the different elements. The one that was a surprise to me was kindness. Like,
Mm,
I'm Middle Eastern, and kindness is viewed as being weak in the Middle East.
mm,
And yet for these people it was viewed as not only a strength, they were kind to themselves, they were kind to others, and then they also engaged in acts of kindness, like volunteering with at nonprofits, and they were so proud of it. And when I asked them, why did you think you were nominated to be in this project, a lot of the answers revolved around being kind, how they were kind to people around them. And it was all foreign to me because I never grew up with that. So,
mm.
anyways, I think those two elements were surprising to me.
That's interesting because in this world today, there's a lot of people who feel, even if they're not Middle Eastern, they seem to feel like kindness is not a good attribute. We got a
Well,
lot of Americans that seem to be in that mindset too.
we're in the age of social media, right? And anonymity, and people can say random things on the internet, and they can just be. And it's funny because I saw a next door conversation a month ago, and I was like, wow, you guys are so unkind.
Yeah,
This person posted something, just randomly asking something, and just the commentary in response was just so. And I was like, does it make them feel good
yeah.
to be that mean?
I think there's to be anonymously mean seems to be a new thing. Like I
Yeah,
see it, it's all over the net. Somebody will post something, and they're not trying to. They just post something, and they might be an artist, and then people immediately like go after them with really vicious attacks. It's like it's one thing to have like constructive criticism, but some people go at it and they're just pure mean meanness, mean spirited. It's not going to help them do better. It's not like a teacher fixing your grammar or fixing your approach and saying, oh, you need to be more declarative, you need to be more like, no, they just to go and do personal attacks and are just mean. And it's like, what's the value in that, except that you're anonymous and you're having a bad day, so you want to make somebody hurt, right? And
uh,
like, what's the value of that?
like I have plenty of videos on the internet, asking me questions or the podcast, and people commented, "Oh, I sound drunk." I'm like, I'm like, do you really think that in the middle of the day doing a podcast, I would
You're
be
gonna be-
drunk?
Some people just have no situational awareness.
No.
I really think that people need to think about what they say. I think we live in an age where people they like to hear the sound of their own voice, and they don't consider, like, look in the mirror and then think about, like, what if somebody said that to you, what you just said?
Well, all I
Are you exempt from your own vitriol?
all I can think of is that people must be suffering, must be in a low place. You have to have a compassion to be saying and doing what they're doing, right?
Yeah,
To
low
make
frequency.
it makes them feel good to make others feel bad.
Well, it's like law of attraction. Like you draw what you're in. Like if you're in a low frequency, if you're in a kind of high frequency, you attract that around you. Like so if you have a bad vibe, then their bad vibes probably rotate all around you. If you like as a musician, I kind of feel it. Like if I get with a group of guys or wherever musicians and we vibe, then we don't even have to talk. We kind of automatically hit the frequency, we automatically hit the beat, and we're totally in sync. If I'm be with a group of guys where like I can't figure out what key I'm in, I don't feel it, I keep have to start and stop, then you're not aligned. There's a lot of people that are like not aligned with like their frequency. Like they don't even know their own frequency. So they're kind of all over the map and they're just radiating this kind of discordance. And I always talk in terms of like notes. Like it's like you're either like in a harmonious mood where you kind of got the lighter up and everybody's like come by be around you, they comfortable be around you, or you're in this kind of dissonance where this noise is kind of like you're prickly, you're abrupt, nobody really wants to be around you because like wow, you're not generating that kind of vibe. So
Well,
that's what you get.
that's what I talks about in my spirituality chapter of my book, Home Wisdom. Was in spirituality, if you can't understand it, there are people you connect with or vibe with better than others, and so I think that's something you can't explain, that's something you can't put in words, but you can connect with them better, and that's a spiritual connection in a way. And so I definitely agree with you, and that's something that words, as I said, you can't explain it.
Yeah, it's hard. But you can see when people are kind of clashing. You see when people just they talk past each other. Like they try to win the argument, they're trying to win the next word response instead of actually listening to what you said, right? So when you're with people and they're just talking over each other or talking at, but there's no comprehension, and it seems like we live in an age where there's a lot of that. There's a lot of people this they go off, they get triggered, they hear one thing, triggers them, and then immediate response is like, "Oh, I hate this person," or "I hate what they're saying," and they don't put it in perspective. They don't put it in context, and it's kind of like it's missed opportunities. Because like if you live where you're just doing that, like where's the opportunity to, society comes together, civilization comes together when you work together. When you work against each other, things tend to go wrong.
Well, it's funny. The sixth element in my book, Communism, was tolerance. And besides having, the obvious racial, religious tolerance, it was a tolerance of ideas, and tolerance of beliefs. And if you meet someone who believes something different than you, who thinks a different way, you don't just discount them as, oh, I don't want to have anything to do with them. They're not smart. They're this. I mean, it's important to listen to them, to be tolerant and figure out what it is they have to say.
Yeah, I think there's a lack of at least empathy, and you don't have to empathize with everybody. Like somebody could be have a dictator, oligarch kind of destructive tendency. Was like I can understand what you're doing, but it's not acceptable what you're doing, right? But I can at least understand why you might be doing it, what might have made you go that way. So maybe I can find a way to solve it without having a conflict. Maybe we can get you to see another way, kind of deprogram. When you have a cult, you have to kind of deprogram Jonestown if you could get to them before they did what they did. But once they get that far, you can't really deprogram them once they drink the Kool-Aid.
Right. True.
But it's interesting, the work you did because it was done in a kind of non-traditional way, even though you come from a science background. What did your whole goal was maybe not to do it in a scientific way because maybe that's what you knew that maybe you're too close to it, so you want to try some like a less of a scientific method.
Well, it's funny because someone asked me, did you have a mentor that helps you? I'm like, no, of course, there's no way you'll have a scientist that believes in something as boo boo as wisdom. So the way I kind of approached it was, okay, it's a woo topic, but I know how to do research. So I'm going to be very rigorous in how I do, how I figure it out and how I define it. But I don't know anything about it. So I think that's really important for everyone is, wisdom is not a sexy topic, but it's really like code word for having meaning, as I mentioned, being content. And it's important for people to realize that everyone can have a few of the elements or more or less and read it and feel like, oh, this has changed my life. It's kind of changed the way I thought. So going back to what you said, no, I did not have any. There was no one to kind of emulate.
Mhm.
All I knew was to kind of do the research and be rigorous about that.
Is there any like a lot of times when people read a book, they get like their first reading, they take away some key items, like the key lessons learned. So if someone is reading your book, what did you have an intent for them to take away like 3 or 5 key lessons learned that
Well,
you
I
you
think
took away?
it's funny because I thought about it, and the book is not a self help per se. It does, but it's more of a, oh, that's the way I can look at things. And so I think the biggest issue was when you encounter a difficulty, realize it's happening for you and not to you.
Hmm.
And in everything you approach, have faith and live in faith, as I said, non fear, and know that it will work out. So someone was like, well, does that mean that we don't do anything? I'm like, no, it doesn't mean you don't work hard, but it also means that you're not afraid. You don't have anxiety about the outcome. You're
Yeah.
like, you're going to give it your best, but whatever happens, happens.
Well, you kind of like, you gotta live in a moment. It's like if I'm with a group of musicians, right, we could obsess about getting a song exactly right? That we get it note for note, exactly the way it was written down. And we can measure that and say that means we had a success. Or we could say, you know what? We trust our ability and we're going to vibe the way we feel that night based on the crowd, based on the room, based on our own connections. And if it doesn't sound like it did yesterday and it doesn't sound like it will tomorrow, it's actually good that it sounds uniquely that way for this moment. And there's nothing wrong with that. And we let it go and we move on to the next day without trying to beat ourselves up about how it came out about. And it's a different type of mindset because it's like you're not trying to be perfect, you're just trying to be present. You're trying to
Yeah,
be
and that's very important, and that's part of having wisdom. And I don't like to say because it's another label, as I mentioned to you. I don't like labels, but it's a sense of peace, like a sense of, oh, it'll be okay, it'll be fine. I'm gonna do my best, as you said. We're gonna vibe, and we'll see how it works out. It'll be fine. It may be different, but it'll be fine.
yeah, it's not yeah, that's the thing is like there's so much pressure on people to be, perceived as perfect or perceived of not making that mistake. But anybody like if you talk to any entrepreneur, the way they got successful is because they learned from their missteps. They learned from the process that they didn't go from 0 to 100. Like no, and like they lied if they did because nobody goes from 0 to 100 and suddenly is like there. They usually have to step, on every rung on the ladder till they get there. And sometimes it's a wave and it goes up and down and it's not always like this straight shot up. And that journey is what life's about.
I
And
feel like even I've mentioned my book too. I think it was in the resilient chapter. You're not gonna the person who you think has it all, whether it's the good life, the money, the whatever it is, they have it all. That's not gonna be the person you're gonna go to if you're encountering a difficulty, because you're gonna feel like they probably lack the depth to understand it. It's gonna be the person who has had their ups and downs, who has kind of quote failed, or has whatever happened, they've realized that life is not perfect
yeah,
and it has its ups and downs, and that's what makes you, and that's what makes you wiser or more present in the moment and more aware of your situation. So
yeah,
I
you're gonna
agree.
want to learn from the person who's kind of weathered the storm. The
Right.
captain that's gone through a lot of really bad weather versus the guys that, well, I've never run into a storm my whole life. It's like, I don't know if I want to be on his ship
No, I
because if
agree.
something happens, it's like he doesn't know what to do. It's
No,
like that's not what you need. It's
I
nice that he
agree.
never ran into a storm, but it's like that's not the person I want to be
I
leading me
agree.
down that path. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting anecdotes that you can get from what we've been talking about. Um, like in your life, is there? I always like to ask this question. I'm kind of throw it out there. Is like, are there three things about you that people would not expect from our conversation today that you could relay to
I think the whole you don't judge and you don't assume and you don't, because you have no idea. Like, I vividly remember I was writing my book and I mentioned to my editor, oh well, I've had a hard life, and the assumption was a hard life is being poor. And I'm like, oh no, I was definitely poor, but it was way more than that. I had parents that did their best, but they were not kind. didn't really, that I didn't really feel a lot of love. I didn't really have the support. So I had other issues. And so assuming that, oh, someone has it all or they had, they had the foundation. No, don't assume. That's probably why I have a bigger issue with that. Is
Mm.
assuming is so off.
Yeah, that's a bad way. When so many people are like, we just go by surface things, because that's we use our eyes. We should be using our ears and other things, But people are 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 not willing to to actually take the in account the depth of people's personalities or their capabilities. And so we run into a world where we got these algorithms and all these machine tools. So like, look at somebody's resume, and if they don't have like that one acronym or that one thing they're looking for, they won't even talk to them. They won't even actually talk to the person to find out like maybe this person doesn't have this skill set, but they've got this life experience. They did this. If I actually talk to them for half an hour, they might be the best person for the job. But the people just go on the surface. They try to pull out the short list. And
It's probably
we're all
worse.
kind of accused of pulling that short list when we meet somebody and saying, "Oh yeah, I know who they are," and you don't know who they are.
Right. And that's why everyone, as you said, has more layers to them. And what you're saying is probably, I mean, it's probably what you're describing is probably worse now that we have AI.
Yeah, it is.
And AI is less personable than we would think. So I don't know, you just have to. So as I was doing the project, people who were nominated to be in the project were like, "Oh, thank goodness you're doing this. We really need it." I'm like, "Yeah, we do. We really do." And so I think it's because more so than ever, we have the internet dividing people, right? They have a whole algorithm. We have AI putting people in categories. So it's becoming a lot less personal.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the human factor, there's a lot of people who are, like intellectuals, like tech guys, right? They just because you can do it, just because you can build this AI tool, doesn't mean that that personal connection that a human being has by speaking and connecting is unnecessary. And they would might like you to believe it's not necessary. They can just have an office building full of robots, an assembly line full of robots, an AI doing data scientist work without the human being involved, and that's all good. And it's like the human factor is always going to be needed because like the machine's never going to be a human being. It's never
And
gonna have that human frailty, and it's like it's good and bad what humans do. Like it's a perspective. It's like we're not all perfect, and that's probably the good thing that we're not all doing the same thing the same way every day, all the time, 24/7. But why would you want to do that?
so I think it's interesting. One of my interviewees wrote an article and he compared wisdom to AI. And it was the idea that being human can never be replaced by a computer. Exactly what you said. So I think it's that's why I really don't worry about AI in any way, because there's no way. I have met some people who'd rather go pay more and do whatever that does not include AI because
Yeah,
of that.
yeah. It's kind of there's a certain the people when they see the result, especially with like art, like AI art, it can make something that looks like art, but my family's full of real artists, people who are painters and graphic artists, and oils and everything, right? And so when they look at what the AI generates, it's like, well, it's kind of fluff. It's kind of like junk food art. Like it looks like it might be art to somebody with like an untrained eye for art, but if you really go into depth of art, there's a lot of emotion. There's a
Yeah.
lot of human passion, and it looks kind of soulless, right? And you're like, and if you don't understand the difference between like something that's kind of flash, kind of junk food art versus like soulful art, well, then
Right.
I can't explain it to you because you won't figure it out. You'll say, well, AI can do the art because that's your point of view, but that's not the real deal.
Right. So when it comes to AI, I don't worry. I think it'll help us. It'll kind of make some things easier, but overall, no.
Yeah, it's a tool. It's like any tool, you
Right.
know. Like if you take it as a tool, but if I'm
Right.
not going to use a tool to do 100% of my work,
Right.
especially if I'm an artist, like I might use it to do something that's like repetitive that I don't really need to put all my effort into to clean something up. But in terms of being the main driver of what I'm trying to accomplish through art, I'm not really keen on that. But that's kind of like a whole battle that people are going to be in the middle of. But I think like at the end of the day, the human being's going to win out because
I
it's
agree.
still yeah, we still have people who make things by hand. There's still like at sea, there's people who build cars by hand, build motorcycles by hand, to build things by because people want it. They
Yeah.
want to know that a human being crafted it, that it's
Right.
actually like that is my unique piece of work that's not mass produced or created by some, assembly line. They want to know that there's a little heart and soul and spirit in it. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon.
And
Um,
I agree.
but I really thank you for being on the show. I want to mention your website again. So if people go to your URL, what can they find there? Where they find a way to get to your book, or they find other
So,
things?
so I have two, and the wisdomresearchproject.com is what I used initially to even get the 60 people. And then now it kind of describes the book and it kind of leads to this one, lauragabayan.com. And some people are like, well, how do I remember? Why did you name it that? I'm like, remember, common wisdom is the name because the 8 common elements. And also, these were common everyday people. Someone once asked me, oh, did you have a say in? I'm like, no, as a scientist, you have no say in anyone who's part of it. They're like, were there any famous people? I'm like, no, you have no say. That's what common wisdom means. They're and it's funny because after and I did interview 60 people. After around 20, I heard the same stories of the same sense of, you know what, life was hard and difficult and I had obstacles, but I'm okay and everything will be okay. It was a sense of peace. And the book, as you know, someone else was like, oh, having been written by someone, well, yeah, I have some letters behind my name, but that doesn't change the fact that I did not want it to be boring. I did not want it to be difficult to understand. I'm an immigrant, so I want if someone comes to this country and English is a second language, I want them to be able to read this really quickly. So you'll see when you get my book, you'll see how easy it is to read. Common wisdom, the 8 elements, and the reason I wrote 8 elements of a meaningful life is because wisdom, as I said, is kind of like a code word for having meaning in your life.
I believe that. But, everything we've talked about has kind of gotten to that point. But I do appreciate that you've been a guest on the Family Electric Ghost podcast. I want everybody to realize that your URL will be fully clickable. We've been live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. We will be on all the podcast platforms where you can listen to or watch a podcast by tomorrow. That includes like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, Major Play, iHeartRadio. So we'll talk. I'm glad that we talked, and it's really cool to meet new people all the time. And I do appreciate the time you took with me today to explain what you've done with your research and your book.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good night.